All right, everybody. Shalom and welcome. Yishai Fleischer here, broadcasting from Judea. Today, we're going to talk about not the politics that's happening on the global stage and not necessarily the war that we've had with Hamas. We're going to talk about a different aspect of Israel, and that is its economics. How is it shaping up, Israel? Is it working good for the individual person living in this country? What about the taxes? Aren't they too high? What about the system of governance, a kind of socialism filled with old school bureaucracy? Are we breaking through it? And these are some things that you may not know about Israel. You may think that Israel is very much a country like America. Some ways it is, in some ways it's not. Maybe you think of it as a more European country. Some ways it is, some way it's not. Sometimes you could think of Israel as a type of Middle East country. Well, what is Israel economically? What is its a system of governance? How exactly is it doing? How does it compare to the rest of the world?
From selling oranges to selling missile technology, in the space of 75 years, Israel's economy has risen from nothing into $500 billion behemoth.
So that's what I want to deal with today. And I also, of course, want to deal with problems, but also solutions. How do we move forward? Because that's what we're all about. We're all about building this country and making it awesome. A bigger Israel is better for the world. In order to tackle these things, I have with me Gilad Alper, who is an Israeli economist. I met him when we actually ran together in the 2019 elections at the Zehut Party run by Moshe Feiglin. Today, he's the head of Israel's Freedom Party. I think he's got strong libertarian tendencies. We'll talk about that. He was the member of an advisory committee for the finance minister. He's been an analyst and an economist for 25 years. He worked in a lot of cool places like Commerce Bank and Merrill Lynch. And he also graduated with honors at the economics department at Tel Aviv University and holds a graduate degree from the Norwegian School of Economics. All right. Is that a good thing? We're going to find out more. Gilad Alper joins us. Shalom, Gilad. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Okay. So, the last year and a half, this show has been dealing with the war and sometimes with politics. But today we want to deal with economics. I want to admit to you right now that I've always felt that I wish I could go back to college and study more economics and that I would have understood how important it really is. But before we get to the hard economics, let's first actually, touch a little bit of politics. Inauguration of Donald Trump in the United States. You did a whole video about the importance of this election and its impact on Israel. So what do you think? The Trump moment, is it one that's going to be good for the world and good for Israel?
I think so. I think that Trump, at least in some of his major policies when it comes to economics and other matters, most of what he does or plans to do is, I think, very positive, especially to deregulate the economy, try to make the government a lot more efficient, which is what Musk and Ramaswamy are supposed to be doing. So that's great. His use of tariffs is more questionable, but I hope it's going to be used more as a weapon to get other countries to play ball rather than they actually happening in reality, because tariffs by and large are bad for everyone. So I hope it doesn't end up doing it after all.
Okay, so there's supposedly a new, what we would call here in Israel, Ministry of Government Efficiency. I mean, could we even contemplate of such a thing in Israel, that there would be a new ministry to make sure that the rest of the ministries don't get out of whack and don't become too big? Could you contemplate such a thing?
Well, I think it all comes down to a question of policy and what the government actually wants to achieve and what the people wants to achieve. It's not so much a question of exactly how you build administration to facilitate the cut in budget or becoming more efficient or whatever. You actually want to do it. What's happening in the US over the past 1 year or 6 months is that characters like Elon Musk and Ramaswamy have joined the political arena, and these guys are very much into capitalism, entrepreneurship, efficiency, and Trump also is apparently, obviously sympathetic to these ideas, so this thing is actually happening. In Israel, the problem is not so much the lack of practical ability to achieve the same type of efficiency and cutting the budget and all that. All of that is technically possible and even easy. The question is that of, the will to do it, the public will, the political will, and that doesn't exist yet.
I asked a very good friend of mine who's a shrewd businessman here in Israel, and he's got a lot of complaints about the bureaucracy and about all these ministries and sub-ministries and all kinds of hoops that you have to jump through bureaucratically. And I said to him, what should I ask Gilad Alper? So he said to me, well, but we know the changes that need to be made. We know the liberalization that needs to be made. But how do you actually do it when you have a country whose number one employer is the state? It also employs many subcontractors who also are, again, working for the state, and basically has a bureaucratic socialist type system at its root. How do you change that? Is there a will of the people to make that kind of change? I don't hear Knesset members talk about it a lot.
Absolutely, that's a good point. When you hear about what politicians want to do, and if you listen to the media, especially the mainstream media, then certainly the impression is that there's no will and there's no sense of urgency in having to make the economy or the government, the public market, more efficient and a lot smaller. There's no, and yes, that's an issue. If you look at the history, then usually when Israel did some economic reforms, as in tried to actually significantly liberalize the economy, it happened in two major instances. In 1985, when we ran an inflation of 100% a year, and the country was basically on the brink of complete economic ruin, and then we did a lot of positive economic reforms. The second time it happened was in 2002, during the second Intifada and the bursting of the dot-com bubble in the US, where the yield on the government debt went up to 12%, and Israel was basically, close to bankruptcy. And then we also didn't have a choice, so we had to enact some free market reforms, by the way, led by the current Prime Minister Netanyahu, and that saved us then. So arguably, the conclusion is that Israel does what it needs to do only when we don't have a choice. And I hope that's not the same case again, because this time I think things are a lot worse than what they used to be. And the dangers we're facing also in the near term in terms of the economy and the implications of the economic crisis we might be going into are so severe that I just hope that we'll do it in time before arguably it's too late, and it could be too late, which sounds a little bit maybe, extremely pessimistic, but I think that's where we stand.
Okay, spell it out for me. Is it the cost of the war?
So, well, look, even before the war started, the economy wasn't doing very well. Or more accurately, there was one sector in the economy that did extremely well and has been doing extremely well, on and off for the past 20 years or 25 years, and that's the tech sector, actually 30 years. The tech sector is responsible for 60% of Israel's export. I think it employs something like, or it accounts for 20% of GDP. It employs something like 15% of the workforce. So it's an extremely important sector. But the point is that it's a lot more important than what people give it credit for.
It's even more important than people know. You're saying,
If we take an extreme scenario, let's say the sector completely goes up in smoke. There's no tech in Israel. The shekel will plummet to such levels that the level of the standard of living in Israel is going to plummet, but completely plummet, as in fall to the floor. We won't be able to finance most of our imports, and we're going to be in a dire straits. And also because Israel, unlike other countries, for example, Greece, can't exist as a poor economy. We have to have a very thriving economy. And the reason for that is because we need to finance a very big military. And the only way to finance a big military is to have a lot of taxes. And the only way to have a lot of taxes is to have a big, thriving, prosperous economy.
So we can't be like a Spain or a Greece.
No. We have to do very well. Right. We have to do very well. Again, otherwise we don't have a big enough army. So if you look at the economy until the war, we already had all of the problems we have now, which is an extremely heavily regulated economy, huge trade barriers on everything. The budget is too big. The government is too big. There's too much central planning. Everything other than the tech sector wasn't doing well. And you could also see it in the type of Jews that immigrate to Israel. The only significant immigration we had until the war started was from the former Soviet Union, right? So Russia, Belarus, and the Ukraine. But if you look at immigration of Jews to Israel from other countries in the West, then the immigration is close to zero. If you compare the number of Jews that immigrate here compared to the size of the local community, then
There's
for
about
example,
3,000 American Jews that come here every year. That
which is
number has
zero. It's zero.
Right.
I mean,
Well,
compared
where
to
I
local,
live, because I see them and I feel them and I see their success, and I also hear a lot from them because of my programming. So to me, it's not zero. I think what you mean is a statistical type of zero, right? But for us, we really do, like the town that I live in here, we're really comprised of these people, and they're still making aliyah. But I understand what you're saying, which is like when you go to America, when you hang out in Florida or New York or California, you see there's tons of Jews, and they're not moving to Israel. And one of the main reasons is economics. There's just better economics in America and questionable economics here in Israel. Starting a business here is hard, unnecessarily, they feel.
right. So when I say it's basically zero, I mean zero compared to the size of local community. But I'll give you an example. About 8 weeks ago, I think, there was a big item on the national TV where they showed how a plane full with Jewish immigrants from the US landing in Israel, being received by reps from the government, and there was a lot of dancing and flag waving, and everything was great. And of course, the problem, but not exactly problem, but what I did notice in that item is that everyone in the plane, as far as I could see, was wearing a yarmulke. Everyone was a religious,
a skull cap or religious.
Yeah. They're all religious. Now,
outwardly observant.
Yeah, obviously, I have no problem with that. I wish all the religious Jews from all over the world come to Israel. But my point is that it demonstrates how secular Jews don't come here because economically it doesn't make sense.
Right. You need a different trigger. In that case, a religious, religious Zionistic type trigger brings them to the land of Israel. But if it was if you took out the Torah God aspect of it, then you'd be like, I don't think it makes sense to move to Israel.
Right.
Which we'd like to change, right, Gilad?
Of course. And now things are going to get worse because of the war, we're going to have to pay a lot more taxes because the budget of the army is going to increase by at least 50%. And I'm not talking about the expenses of the war right now, which are huge. I'm talking about, the coming 10 years. Every year on a permanent basis, the military budget, or the defense budget, if you want to call it like that, is going to increase by about 50%. And people are going to have to serve more time in the army, in the reserve, I mean. We're going to have now full 3 years of, people joining the army when they hit 18 years old. It was 2.5 years up until the war, but now it's 3 years. As I said,
mandatory service.
Compulsory service.
Right. Not everybody knows that most Israelis, not all, but most Israelis, when they're 18 or 19, sometimes serve for 3 years in the army. There's various programs, but generally speaking, the majority serve for 3 years. We have exemptions for the ultra-Orthodox. There's also exemptions for Arabs, but there are some Arabs and some ultra-Orthodox that serve. But generally speaking, the regular Israeli serves for 3 years in the army, but it shrank down to about 2.5 years. So Gilad is telling us that it's now going up to 3 years. And I could tell you, Gilad, I am post-surgery right now. I had a big surgery about a month ago. I'm getting close to Baruch Hashem. I'm getting close to 50, in a few years. And I just got a call from the IDF reserves saying, listen, we'd like you to come to this new unit. We're forming this unit. And I'm like, and you need me? And they're like, yeah, we definitely do. So reserves are going to be growing. More time in reserves and more time in the standing army. So, the war made it clear that Israel's defenses are not up to snuff, and they need to be rebuttressed as opposed to shrunken as previous governments did. And so therefore, it's going to be more costly to the taxpayer. That's what you're saying.
Well, yeah. Now, whether the army actually needs to become bigger or is it just a question of poor management is something I'm not completely sure of. So I will leave that aside. Let's assume we need a much bigger army and a much bigger budget. That means a lot more taxes. So you have all of the problems that exist in the economy so far, which, like I said, regulation, cost of living. We can go into more details into that.
I want you to go into some
Oh,
detail because I want
okay,
people to
okay,
understand
okay.
what the costs are in this country. For example, for cars
Okay, so let me go into more
and
details a
fruits.
little bit. Everything in Israel is very expensive compared to other Western countries, sometimes 30 or 40% more expensive. And I'm talking about everything. Apartments in Israel, extremely expensive. Even if you work in the tech industry and you belong to the top 10% of income earners in Israel, it's going to be extremely difficult, nearly impossible for you to buy an apartment in Tel Aviv and even just other parts of the center of Israel. Very tough without a very, very large mortgage.
So
If
we're talking just to give people clarity. We're talking $500,000 is on the low end of what an apartment costs today.
if
Yeah,
you
in
want to
Israel.
buy an apartment around the center of Israel, where most of the employment is, most of the business opportunities, most of the commercial and cultural life in Israel are, then $500,000 is very, very much low. Is very much on the low side, very
Right,
much.
right.
So yeah, so apartments are very expensive. And by the way, I should say they're expensive not because of any kind of structural or technical issues. It's all a question of policies. The regulation in the real estate industry is extremely cumbersome. There's a big, some kind of distortion with municipal taxes, which also prohibit the construction of residential units. We have a problem with not enough land is being freed by the state. So because of all of those issues, there's just aren't enough apartments and houses being built in Israel, which creates too much demand or not enough supply. It's of course the two sides of the same coin. So prices are very high. Cars are extremely expensive in Israel because the state imposes an 83% sales tax on cars, because we need to finance the very big budget that we have. So cars are very expensive. Now, also food is very expensive, a good 30 or 40% more expensive than other countries in the OECD, or meaning other developed countries. And that's because of two main reasons. Firstly, there are a lot of barriers on imports of food. Extremely tough to import food into Israel, and sometimes it's just outright
Why is it tough to import
impossible.
food? Is it because a country, let's say like, I don't know, Spain doesn't like Israel, it doesn't like Israeli policies? Is that the reason?
Everyone likes money, and our money is as good as anyone else's. No, the question is just government policy. The
Israeli government
government,
policy.
yeah. The government, because of pressure from the agricultural lobby, is protecting farmers by basically forbidding imports or making imports extremely cumbersome or complicated, by imposing tariffs, by bureaucracy, by regulations, by
But does
whatever
that
means.
does that end up protecting the Israeli farmer?
Well, if you enjoy a local monopoly, that's fantastic. So why not? I should say just immediately that the other means by which the country or the government is clogging the food market is by basically, many years ago, we've erected a couple or a few committees that basically micromanage the food market, special elements of it, eggs, dairy products, poultry, meat in general. Everything is managed by the state. And I mean closely managed, as in who can do what, at what prices, what quantities, who can you sell it to, again, at what prices. And there's like a quota system and other like a Bolshevik type system that makes the market extremely inefficient, which of course works at some instances for the benefit of some farmers that have good connections in the government and are given friendly treatment. But 10 million Israelis are condemned to eating expensive food, sometimes low quality food, sometimes with a very low selection and variety because of the limitations on imports. And sometimes you actually have real shortages in butter, in avocados or guacamole, in other stuff because of all of those policies. And again, nothing is written in stone. Nothing is written in the Bible. It's not like we have a commandment from God not to import bananas into Israel. But the government does do that, which is why the price of food in Israel is very expensive.
So let me just ask you a sub-question for a second. When
Yeah.
you say government, do you mean Knesset members, or do you mean a type of bureaucracy that gets formed over time, layers of bureaucrats, and it becomes such that it's not even decisions anymore? It's not top-down decisions. It's just a kind of system that keeps perpetuating itself. I want to give you a little story. I was dealing with a minister in the Israeli government, and the minister says to me one day, he goes, we were having some argument, some issue. He says to me, do you know how this makes me look in front of the pkidut, the bureaucrats? And the way he said it to me, I was like, he has got to justify his behavior. He's not sending orders down. They're the bosses, the bureaucrats. And basically he can have a little wiggle room, but he's got to justify himself in front of them, not the other way around. I realized what a strong, bureaucracy we have. So I wanted to ask you, and I know you talk about this, like, are the regulations, are they all the way at the top, or are they at some kind of mid-level place where just things get stuck and people get jobs to be bureaucrats, and therefore they have to make little laws and little inconveniences?
For sure, there's some self-sustaining bureaucracies that kind of impose their will on politicians and are very tough to dismantle and so on. In this case, no, there's no such problem. The problem is that politicians are cowardly. Sometimes they don't even understand what's at stake. They don't even understand the causality. They don't think, or some of them don't understand that prices are high because there isn't a free market. They maybe delude themselves into thinking that the prices are expensive because, because the population is too large and we can't allow ourselves to import food because then we won't be able to sustain ourselves. And then in times of war, we're all going to starve to death and all of that. And all of this is wrong. Everything is wrong. All of that. But because, again, of the political power of the agricultural lobby, because of their ability to hurt politicians in some of the larger parties, especially the Likud party, which has been the ruling party in Israel for the past, well, on and off since 1977, I guess.
Wait, and now,
because of that,
question.
Politicians aren't fixing the problem. The problem is technically easily fixed.
Okay, the Likud is a right-wing party.
By name only. By name only.
Uh-huh.
The official label that the Likud, labels itself or calls itself is the National Liberal Party. And they mean that in the classical sense of the word liberal. So basically almost libertarian. Not exactly, but close to it. However, in practice, there's no connection to how they actually rule. The Likud party is basically part of the uniparty system, which exists in most of the West. And everyone in practice, no matter what party, rules like a left-wing, semi-socialist party. Everyone. Which is, by the way, again, as I say, like many other places in the world, and also like the Republican and Democrat party, at least until Trump came to power.
It's very rare to hear in Israel discussion about smaller government, smaller taxes, i.e. conservative economics. Very rare to hear that discussion. I bumped into it recently in Israel Hayom. There was an article, but the point is that it's not often like our right-wing politicians, let's say Ben Gvir or Smotrich, or folks in the other right-wing parties, including the Lieberman party and stuff, they will be so-called right-wing about security, but not about shrinking government. When you go to America, let's say you go to a CPAC conference, you're going to hear a lot about smaller government. You're going to hear it, and you hear it very loudly about government efficiency. You're going to hear a lot about free market and free market capitalism. You don't hear a lot about that here in Israel. So how do you change that? I think actually before we get to that question, I think we cut you off when we were talking about the costs of the war and the future costs of the country, and I asked you to spell out kind of the challenge that's ahead. But then let's get after that, if you can answer also the question on
Sure.
Israeli right-wing thinking.
Sure, I have it written down so I won't forget.
Okay.
So if I just finish the line of explaining what's going on in Israel right now. So as I said, apartments are very expensive, cars are very expensive, food is very expensive, and all of those things are a result purely of policies. Nothing is written in stone. As I said, nothing is for structural reasons. And maybe one of the main issues we're facing is that regulation is, or the regulatory burden on the businessman in Israel is horrible. If you look at international comparison as they were made, at least until 2019 by the World Bank, Israel suffers from the 40th heaviest regulatory burden in the world. So if let's say Hong Kong and Denmark and other countries in the West, successful countries in the West, enjoy a very light burden of regulations, rules and regulations, Israel is just terrible in that. It's extremely tough to build a business in Israel. And once you actually, are able to open the business, you end up spending most of your time dealing with the regulations rather than growing your business. And this is happening for two reasons, or maybe even more than two. Firstly, and this is something that's extremely important to remember, is that Israel was founded by socialists, right? And back in the 40s, 1947, 48, 49, 50, and into the 50s and 60s, Israel was ruled by socialists, some of them downright Marxists. And they hated the private sector. They hated businessmen. They hated entrepreneurs. Everything in their eyes was supposed to flow from government. And government back then was owning large pieces of the economy. Although I'm not sure if all, but most of the big industrial conglomerates back then in Israel were owned more or less by the government or by the state. And this type of hatred and the framework they put in place back then to hamper the initiatives of businessmen is with us today, in spirit and in practice. And the second reason the regulation in Israel is so bad is because regulations are terrible for the small businessmen, for small businesses, but they're fantastic for large businesses, for the big, importers and big industrialists and all of those guys. Those guys obviously enjoy very heavy regulations that prevent competition from emerging. I mean, these guys, the large companies, they're very good in dealing with the regulations. They have lawyers, accountants, and in some cases, and maybe in most cases, the big companies are the ones that actually wrote the regulations that were designed to begin with to stop competition. And then using political donations and other types of political influences and other means and whatever, they manage to get politicians to pass regulations that are supposedly slated to defend the citizens, the people, the small people, but in practice, it's there just to protect the bigger businesses. And the third reason that regulations in Israel are so heavy is that it creates the possibility of getting bribes, right? So the regulators and the politicians, some of them allegedly, I'm not actually saying it outright, might be actually enjoying a nice steady stream of bribes that are being paid by people that are just facing insurmountable obstacles in managing their businesses. And sometimes the easiest thing to do is just to pay someone 20,000 shekels so they can finally, release your new machine that you just bought from customs. Mm-hmm. So this is a huge issue. huge issue that, again, needs to be dealt with. Israel needs to have the lightest regulatory burden in the world, as far as I'm concerned. It's a fantastic thing to have a very small regulatory burden. And I wish we were number one in that rather than the number 40.
This war, what is its impact?
Let me try to demonstrate it by building a scenario, a theoretical scenario. Say you're a computers engineer in Israel. You're 30 years old. You have a wife and I don't know, and a baby, right? You're a pretty good engineer. Not necessarily a genius, but you're pretty good. Now you're facing two options. The first option is you continue to live in Israel. You're going to have to now serve 45 days every year in the reserve. And your son is going to have to join the army for full 3 years when he gets to where he's 18. You're going to have to pay a lot more taxes in the coming years because of the burden coming from the bigger army. You can't buy an apartment in Tel Aviv or around Tel Aviv because apartments are too expensive, even for you as an engineer.
Or Jerusalem.
Or Jerusalem. Even for you, an engineer who belongs to the top 10% of income earners in Israel. You're sending your kid to one of the worst educational systems in the world, in the developed world. Absolutely terrible. The traffic jams are becoming worse every following year, every passing year. And you can't actually open up a business if you want to, although you don't have to because you're an engineer. And you're paying a lot of money for food, much more than your counterparts would pay in the Western world. Okay, so you have one option, which is to stay in Israel and just continue like that. Now,
right,
another option.
Wait, just to make it clear, but in that option, with all those challenges, you get to live in the Jewish state. You get to breathe the air of the land of Israel. Your mom and your dad live close by. You do get a Jewish life. You speak the Hebrew language. Your kids are probably not going to assimilate out. Going to the army has a certain bit of honor in it also, and a certain respect that you gain. And you're part of Jewish history and part of something great. But your economic outlook is challenged.
And now is there a second option? The second option is you're getting a call from a headhunter, and he offers you to come and take up a job in Prague, in the Czech Republic.
Or Colorado.
I'm saying the Czech Republic deliberately because of a couple of reasons I'll name in a second. And this is what he offers you. The salary you're going to get is maybe the same, maybe a little bit higher. Your cost of living is about 30% cheaper. You're not going to suffer almost any anti-Semitism in the Czech Republic because they have very few Muslims. You won't have to join the army, to serve in the reserve. Your son won't have to join the army when he is 18. The system, the school system is much, much better. And you can fairly easily open up a business if you so choose. And as I said, the cost of living is 30% or 40% cheaper. And people have always immigrated from one place to the other for economic reasons. That was always the main reason people immigrated from the dawn of the human species, right? But it's tough to immigrate because you have to find a school for your kid and you have to find an apartment and it's a new environment and whatever. However, in this case, because you're an Israeli computers engineer, your skills are well known. You're in high demand, so the headhunter or the company that wants to hire you is going to take care of finding an apartment for you. They're going to take care of finding a school for your kid. You're going to anyway get the support of the local Jewish community or local Israeli community, and you're going to live a much, much better life than you do in Israel from an economic perspective. Although everything else you said about the advantages of living in Israel is correct. And obviously it depends on your priorities. But as a computer engineer that wants to go now and take up a job in Prague, you don't even have to tell that you're living in Israel. You're red, as we call in Hebrew, right? You can lie to yourself. You can say, hey, I'm just relocating for a few years. I want to see what it feels like to work outside of Israel. I want to save some money. I want my kid to learn other languages, blah, blah, blah. You can make all of the excuses that you want. But then you end up in Prague, you have a great job, life is extremely easy, you're much, much richer than you were before. The Czech Republic is very close to Israel. You can visit every couple of weeks, if you so choose, partly because you're making so much more money in terms of your purchasing power, right? Because your salary might be as high, but your costs are much lower. And my fear is that a huge amount of people that work for the tech industry in Israel are going to say yes. Because why pay so much taxes? Why send your kid to the lousiest school in the West? Why spend 45 days every year serving the army? Why? Why suffer all of these things where where you can fly, take the plane, you fly 3 hours, you get to Prague, to the Czech Republic, and you can enjoy your life so much more than you do now. And on the background, I have to also add that the security situation in Israel isn't great. It's not great. Oh, and another issue. If you live in the Czech Republic, although I'm not sure if it applies also to non-Czech citizens, but at least Czech citizens are free to buy weapons to defend themselves. You can buy guns, you can buy PCCs, you can buy rifles, you can buy almost whatever you want. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but not by much. In Israel, Jews, by and large, are not allowed to own guns. There are very strong restrictions. You have to have been in the army doing this and that. You have to be on this age. You have to be, I don't know, a few things.
And you have to be living in what they deem to be a dangerous place.
Which is so stupid. I mean, everywhere in Israel is dangerous.
Right.
I live 30 minutes away from the West Bank. That's not a risky location. And I served in the army for 3 years as a combat soldier. I spent years in reserve. I have no criminal record. I'm healthy. I actually know how to use a gun because I took a course. I don't have a gun. The state of Israel deemed me not worthy of being able to protect myself, a Jew in Israel. But if you're a Jew in the Czech Republic, especially if you're a citizen, then no problem. So how does it make sense that the state of Israel forbids Jews in the state of Israel from owning guns and protecting themselves? I mean, that was basically the entire point of the state of Israel,
right,
to be a refuge to Jews and allowing them the privilege, but it's not a privilege, it's a right of self-defense.
That's right.
And this is just another example why you can see why maybe for a lot of people it doesn't make sense to stay here. And just to finish the argument, the problem, as I said, I don't know, half an hour ago, that the economy is very much based on the tech sector. And this is a huge risk facing Israel, because if enough employees and enough entrepreneurs from the tech sector come to the conclusion that living here is becoming just too much of a pain, then the economy is going to suffer greatly, to the point where we might not be able to finance a large military. And that's an existential threat.
And let's also, if we're going to already talk about that, the threat of the tech sector leaving, let's also add the sociological fact that the majority of people that work in the tech sector come from a more secular Tel Aviv location and mindset. And therefore, when either the state disappoints them because it's, in their mind, let's say too right-wing and it's got too many characters that they don't like, or that there's a reformation in the legal system that they don't like, or they simply don't have the same gravitational pull, as you mentioned about Aliyah. They don't have the same religious, I'm not saying they're not religious, but they don't have the same religious convictions. And by the way, when you have a lot of religious convictions, you're also less likely to go into the tech sector because you're probably less likely to have the time to study all that stuff. It takes a lot of years of study. So the secular world has more incentive, and we see that when you go to places like Florida or New York and you go see where Israelis are living en masse, it's mostly the less observant that make it out to these places, or let's say California, Northern California, in the the tech hub over there in Silicon Valley. So there's a lot of rationales for them to leave, and you're saying that has an existential danger on our economics of the country, which has an impact on the security of the country. On the other hand, Gilad, I need to say that Israel's population has only grown and grown and grown. Right? Like we are now over 7 million Jews in the country. When I was born, there was 3.5 million Jews. So right. the tendency is the other way, I would say, overall.
If you look at the immigration to Israel, to and from Israel, then up until, let's say, 2 years ago, it was either somewhat balanced or maybe slightly maybe a smaller number, more Jews actually left Israel than immigrated to Israel, but by a small margin. And so in that regard, you're right. So far, we haven't seen a large, how should we say, people fleeing Israel en masse. Right, however, my point is that firstly, things now are a lot worse than they were 2 years ago. And secondly, the people that can leave easily are exactly the people that if they do leave, the economy is going to crash.
Right.
And this is and the thing is, so far, we're only feeling, economically speaking, a very small part of the burden of the war. We just now saw some taxes coming up. We're just now seeing
VAT has increased from 17 to 18%.
Yeah, exactly. But it's just now happening. The government is still trying to get their heads around how to deal with the budget and the big deficit. Things are actually going to get worse over the next few years because all of the costs and all of the implications of the army of the war are going to filter into the real economy. I'm a Zionist, right? I'm a Zionist. I'm a part-time politician, whatever. And still, I have to admit that if some 30-year-old computer engineer comes to ask my advice on what to do if he gets a job offer from Prague, I'm not sure that I can really tell him in clear conscience to stay in Israel. Because life here is really, really difficult. Maybe I'm a little bit exaggerating. It's not that we're walking around here crying because of our troubles.
No, the cafes are full. The cities are booming, and
however, if you listen to people, to what they're saying and how they're complaining and the state of mind, and also how many Israelis are trying now to get a second passport, then clearly something is changing.
You know what it is. You know what it is, Gilad. You know what it is. Many of these problems, as you say yourself on your podcast regularly, they're just self-imposed problems. They're problems that could be unplugged and taken off. The situation could be ameliorated in no time. That's the thing. The thing is many of these issues are not because of the war, but because, as you said, of unnecessary regulation, unnecessary taxation, unnecessary bureaucratization. And so, So that's the frustrating element here.
It's extremely frustrating. However, on the other side, it's extremely promising, or at least it gives you reason to become optimistic. Because
all right, we got to the optimistic part of the show.
Well, 100% of our economic issues in Israel, as you said, they're all self-imposed. They're all man-made. There's nothing structural that creates those issues. So if you enact a number of reforms,
let's do it. Give me 3 reforms.
Deregulate the economy.
But a little bit more specific. What do you mean by deregulate the economy?
Well, for example, For example, it takes 10 years to get a building permit in Israel. You want to build an apartment, you want to build a building, you want to build whatever, 10 years. Just to get the permit. And probably you need to bribe someone along the way to make sure that it's 10 years and not 20 years or never. So I would simply delete, abolish, repeal, whatever you want to call it, 99% of these regulations, leaving only regulations that have to do anything with safety, right? To make sure that you use, bricks that don't fall apart. Although even that is unnecessary. because for that you have private construction engineers. But I don't want to go too much into my extreme libertarian positions. I'm saying if you get rid of 90% or 99% of those regulations, then you get a permit in 2 months rather than 10 years.
Okay, so speed up, and probably you're going to also say that the state's hold on the land itself is also a very cumbersome process.
Yeah, I would say that if I have to weigh the, the problems, then regulations and municipal taxes are probably heavier problems than the pace in which the state frees up the land. But never mind, whatever, they can do everything. Everything is technical, everything is doable, and fairly easily from a technical point of view.
Let's keep
not
going.
From a political point of view. Okay, so regulations. The second thing I would do is dismantle immediately all of the committees, all of the Bolshevik committees that manage the food market. Let everyone do whatever they want. Let everyone import whatever they want. Actually make Israel into a free trade area, right? So just a bit like Hong Kong, a bit like, or very much like Hong Kong before China took over. So yeah, deregulate the economy and make Israel the least regulated economy in the West. Why not? Because it's a great thing. Make us a free trade zone, free trade area, whatever you want to call it. And you have to right now enact, I think, some strict measures of austerity. A bit like what Doge is trying to achieve in the US, right? But you have to cut the budget significantly, along with a very heavy reform in the educational system. Because like I said earlier, the education system in Israel is terrible. It's terrible based on international studies and tests. We're just terrible. But we're terrible on the background of the education budget tripling itself over the past 20 years. And Israel now spends as percentage of the GDP on education more than any other country in the West, maybe other than Norway, right? So we spend a huge amount of money as percentage of GDP. The education level is horrible. So what I would suggest, cut the budget.
Isn't that also a big part of that because of the what's it called, the union, the Histadrut union, and the fact that you can't fire teachers? And
so the education system in Israel employs about 200,000 teachers, or 250,000, depending exactly how you categorize them. But anyway, the point is that of those 200,000 teachers, the school system fires between 0 and 3 teachers every year, which means 0. No one is fired. When you have a company or any kind of operation that employs 200,000 people, but that doesn't fire any of them, you know this organization exists only for the benefit of the employees, not of the clients, which are, the kids and their parents. So I would immediately institute the voucher system in a very extreme fashion, as in the state has almost no supervisory powers on the system at all, on content and whatever. And in parallel to that, cut the education budget by 30%. And then you also save many tens of billions of shekels, and you increase the level of education, by a huge margin. So just to summarize, deregulate, dismantle all of the committees that manage the food market, make Israel into a free trade area, go into an austerity policy, which is cutting the government budget, and institute a very heavy, dramatic reform in the education system. You do these 5 things or 4 things, depending on how you count them, Israel is going to become the richest country in the world in 10 years. In 10 years, because we have such a entrepreneurial spirit. We have the best engineers in the world. And the only reason we are not the richest country in the world right now, but rather one of the poorest in the Western world, is only and purely the fault of the state, of government. And in many respects, the state and the government is the number one enemy of the people, which is a very libertarian perspective, I admit. But I think it's very correct, especially in Israel. The more power they have, the less power we do. It's a zero-sum game. And the only reason to become a true Zionistic center of Jews all around the world, the only way to get Jews in droves immigrating from the US to Israel is to make Israel a much more capitalistic country, to become one of the most free market capitalistic countries in the world. And if we do that, our success is assured, because over the past 250 years, there hasn't been a single country in the world that chose to be capitalistic for a long time and didn't prosper. And on the other hand, there isn't a single country in the last 250 years that chose for the long time to become not capitalistic and prosper. That just never happens, unless maybe you're looking at some place like, I don't know, Qatar, one of those places where, you put a stick in the ground and you have oil bursting out. But short of that, the only pathway towards prosperity is capitalism. And until Israel chooses that path, we will never prosper, seriously prosper. We will never become a center of Jews around the world. We'll never get Jews from the US and Canada and Australia and the UK to immigrate to us, unless, of course, anti-Semitism in places like UK goes haywire. And even then, I would expect them to immigrate from the UK to the US rather than to Israel. But put that aside. My point is that unless we become a lot more capitalistic than we are right now, we're doomed.
The word doomed is a strong word for this show. I don't know about doom, but we will. I could say what you said without the word doomed, which is we have a chance to prosper and to grow, and we have a chance to stagnate. And the way you even put it is that it's more than stagnate. It's really endanger our security and our future.
And who wants to stagnate? Who wants to stagnate?
Who wants to stagnate? Exactly.
It's such a loser
right, exactly.
agenda. Yeah, my goal is to stagnate. My goal is to be mediocre. My goal is to be meh. No, my goal is to be the best in the world in everything. And the only way to achieve that is to be capitalistic. There's just no other way. You can hate capitalism, you can love capitalism. I love it because I think it's an extremely moral system. But I don't think you can argue that there's no other way.
And now a total curiosity question. Do you think that capitalism comports with the Torah's understanding of economics for the Jewish people? I'm just wondering.
Look, I would say this. I mean, Israel, since the days of Joshua and until the kingdom of Saul, was an anarcho-capitalist country, basically.
What? Was a what?
Anarcho-capitalist country. We were anarchists and capitalists to a large degree, right? We didn't have a king. We didn't have any central authority. All of the tribes basically ran themselves. Tribes, you can also call it cantons if you want to compare it to Switzerland of these days, for example. And we prospered for about 400 years. Back then we prospered, we became strong. We managed to beat our enemies every time that they, tried to attack Israel, which happened every, 40 years or so. We built a lot of property. Okay, I don't want to go into the Bible too much right now, but the way Saul got people to join the army was to threaten them that he would, take their property away from them, right? Kill their sheep or whatever. So they had sheep. They had property. There was wealth back then. And then the people came to the prophet Samuel, demanded for a king, and 3 generations later, the kingdom was destroyed. Which I think wasn't a coincidence at all. Because as a reminder, the reason the kingdom was destroyed was because the people refused to pay the taxes that King Solomon imposed on them. And he's
his son.
He's supposed to be the smartest man alive or something.
No. King Solomon, they were still willing to pay the taxes. After him, Jeroboam and Rechavam and Yerovam.
And then Rechavam ben Avad came and said, you know what? Let's have the kingdom of Israel. And that was the destruction of the state of Israel. But my point is that if you look at their history, then, not having a central governance, being actually an anarchy to a large degree, was very good for us. Look at what Samuel told the people of Israel when they came and asked for a king. He said, look, why do you want that? The king is going to take your property away from you. So why do you want a king? So I ask you today, why do we want the government to regulate us, tax us, tell us what we can import and what we can't import, decide on what we can teach in our schools to our kids, and discuss who can make milk and who to sell it to, and at what price and what quantity? How is this the role of government?
Gilad Alper, thank you very much for a fabulous and very interesting discussion. And there's so many, things that our listeners are going to have to think about. The flip side of what you said is when folks from Western countries come here, they bring with them that spirit, and they bring with them that possibility for change. And Israel, as you said, has had these moments of change. It could very well be that this post-war period, if it is indeed a post-war period, will be a time for a consciousness change in terms of how to really make this country stronger and bigger and not stagnate. We said we don't want that losery outlook, but rather an outlook of how to grow this country and really continue the incredible Zionist project, which we have the great blessing to be part of. And now all we have to do is a little bit of deregulation, and we'll be in good shape. Gilad Alper is a economist, an Israeli economist who sticks in Israel. A Zionist Israeli economist. He ran in the Zehut Party in 2019, now the head of Israel's Freedom Party, was part of the advisory committee for the finance minister, has worked in a lot of cool places, and very much is thinking about the future of Israel. Gilad, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks very much for inviting me.
All right, folks, you are listening to the Yishai Fleisher Show here, broadcasting from Judea to the world. And we're not just rah, 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 we love Israel. We're thinking about how to make it even stronger and better for the future. Please join us. Please be part of it. There's an easy way to join us and to continue to fight for Israel. Fightforisrael.org. That's a great website to go check out our awesome projects. We have a lot of projects over there, including the Biblical Highway and the Abrahamic Faith and restoration of Israeli holy sites, tractors for the Holy Land, and of course, broadcasting truth and courage. Another great way to join us is through buymeacoffee.com/Yishai. Easy way to support the broadcasting efforts. And finally, you could also write me an email, yishai@yishaifleisher.com. So lots of ways to connect to Israel, and don't get distraught. Gilad was talking about ways to fix Israel, to make it stronger. That's the attitude. But you got to look at the problems square in the face and learn to deal with them. Learn to deal with them in a God consciousness and also in a this worldly consciousness. Common sense is also one of God's gifts to humanity and certainly to the Jewish people and to Israel as well. So God bless you, folks, wherever you are. Lots of love and lots of blessings from the land of blessings, and shalom.